Hey, what's going on YouTube? Son of Sanguinius here, and in this video I was just going to give my overall first impressions about the 8th edition rules, and I don't really know how long this video is going to be. It is going to be unscripted, as it's basically just going to be me rolling out my thoughts, but I'm going to try and keep it as clear and concise as possible for you guys, and just sort of not really dive into things too deep, just sort of give my my general feelings about it. So starting from page 176 with the core rules, although I suppose I could briefly mention the 3 ways to play, but regardless, so yeah, you know what, why don't we just start with the 3 ways to play. So basically, I do like what Games Workshop has done with this. Open play, obviously, I think is for beginners or anyone who just really doesn't care about points or balancing out lists or anything like that. A nice way to get people into the hobby. Narrative play is kind of a nice mix between matched and open, I feel, for the sense that the point system or not the point system, the power level system does work generally well, although there are a few exceptions. Depending on how you decide to upgrade, quote-unquote, your units. Basically, if you play it WYSIWYG, which is whatever the model has, then you should be pretty good. However, if one person just brings like a basic 5-man tac squad and the other guy brings a 5-man tac squad that's all jacked up with special weapons and melee weapons on the sergeant, and oh hey, this guy has a heavy bolter, blah 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 blah. Suffice it to say, there is a way to cheese narrative play, but if you're looking to cheese, you're kind of missing the point of narrative play, I feel like. So, anyway, narrative play is cool. I like it. Probably, I would actually recommend narrative play to get people into the game over open play, simply because, at least with narrative, there's at least some level of balance that you can go about building your lists with. And then obviously match play, that's all the points and everything, and that's more or less the 40k that we have experienced before with 7th edition. So moving on to the core rules, starting with the movement phase. Everything is more or less similar to how things were in 7th. The big change, though, is obviously falling back if you were within 1 inch of an enemy unit, so quote-unquote engaged, I think is the proper term. And then advancing, which was previously the run move that we could do in the shooting phase. Now they've moved it into the movement phase. A little less time, you just roll a d6 and add that to your movement value, and that's how far the unit can move at the cost of shooting and charging. So, although of course there are a few units that can advance and charge in the same turn, like Gene Stealers. We might talk about those guys a little bit later, but suffice it to say, the movement phase is what we've come to expect, and overall I feel like it's an improvement over 7th edition, if for nothing else, simply because we can run or advance, as they call it now, in the same phase. They also briefly talk about wobbly model syndrome and reinforcements on this page, and that I feel like that stuff we can cover a little bit later. But regardless, we now move on to the psychic phase. Honestly, I kind of like what they've done with the psychic phase. I was one of those people who did use psychic powers or psychers in a few of my lists, and while I think I understood the psychic phase in 7th for the most part, I will say that it definitely took me a while to get the grasp of it, and at least with this new system, it's much easier to understand and a little bit easier to get into. The one thing that I'm perhaps not so keen on is the fact that every psyker now knows Smite, and it's only a warp charge value of 5, which on 2d6 is really not that hard to get. And then if it's manifested, the closest enemy unit within 18 inches suffers D3 mortal wounds. That just seems a a little bit too powerful in my opinion. If it was D3 root wounds, that'd be one thing, but the fact that every Psyker can know it, and the fact that this power is so easy to get off, it kind of puts an odd taste in my mouth. I'm not quite sure how I feel about that, but if there's one thing that has been the prevailing theory, the prevailing idea with 8th edition, is that things die a lot easier than they did before, or at the very least, things are a lot more deadly. Perhaps should be the better way to put it. And that's true for Psykers. That's true for shooting. That's true for assault. Although there might be some naysayers on the assault side or whatever, with good reason. But anyway, overall, I feel like the psychic phase is done pretty well. Next, we move on to the shooting phase. Honestly, it's pretty much what we expect, although there are a few big changes here. The first one is that you can now sort of split fire, quote-unquote, with your units. So any model in your unit can, fire at a different target. The catch is that you have to declare what models in a unit will be firing at what before you start rolling any dice. And once you start rolling any dice, I don't believe you can change your mind about something. So, for example, say you have a 5-man attack squad. Let's say you had 3 guys shooting at a group of cultists and 2 guys shooting at a group of I don't know, Chaos Spawn for whatever reason. Let's say you roll for those 3 guys and you do nothing to that squad of cultists. You can't then turn around and say, all right, well, instead of these 2 guys firing at that spawn, they're going to fire at the cultists. You can't do that. So once you've declared what models in a unit are shooting at what, you have to then carry on through and roll all the dice for it and resolve it. As I interpret it. If I'm wrong, feel free to leave a comment down below and clarify that for everyone else. They also briefly mentioned the fact that since independent characters no longer exist and characters can't really attach to units anymore, they're just sort of there. They also mentioned that a character can't be targeted by shooting unless it's the closest target. That is... let's see. Well, let me just read it here. A character. Let's see. Some models are noted as being a character on their data sheet. These heroes, officers, prophets, and warlords are powerful individuals that can have a great impact on the course of a battle. The swirling maelstrom of the battlefield can make it difficult to pick out such individuals as targets. However, a character can only be chosen as a target in the shooting phase if they are the closest visible enemy unit to the model that is shooting. This does not apply to characters with a wounds characteristic of 10 or more due to their sheer size. So there you go. Cannot be turned if the closest model that is shooting. So that's interesting. But yeah, so there we go. You can't pick out characters as you would like, only if they are closest to the model that is shooting. So they move on a little bit, talking about the different weapon types. Interestingly enough, you can basically still fire and charge regardless of the weapon type. There is no restriction to firing a rapid fire or heavy weapon and not being able to assault. You can fire any of the weapon types that are listed. There are 5, assault, heavy, rapid fire, grenade, and pistol. You can fire any of those and still charge in the charge phase. So that's pretty cool. And then they also talk about the new toughness and strength sheet, which is pretty nice. Some people have some misgivings about it, mainly the fact that if you think, for example, plasma guns wound on 3s and don't wound on 2s. That is kind of disappointing, but I can see why GW went to this simplified system, and I think things will more or less be better for it in the end. But That is nice. They also mention invulnerable saves, terrain and cover, mortal wounds, yada yada yada. We can dive into that stuff a little bit more in a later video, but suffice it to say, I do like what they've done with the shooting phase. And now let's get into the heart and soul of the Blood Angels, so to speak, the charge and the fight phase. So, let's see, going over with the charge phase, obviously we do have the quote-unquote Phantom Inch that has been added. Now, instead of having to get into base contact, we just have to get within an inch. And that's pretty nice for the charge phase. And then obviously moving over to the fight phase, we can pile in up to 3 inches, and this move can move in any direction, so long as the model ends the move closer to the nearest enemy model. Notice how it says the nearest enemy model and not the model that you are engaged with. Now when we pile in, we can drag other nearby enemy units into close combat, which is awesome. Then they talk about, choosing your targets, choosing, the melee weapon, you resolve the close combat attacks, and then you consolidate, which says you may move each model in a unit up to 3 inches. This can be in any direction so long as the model ends the move closer to the nearest enemy model. So again, even when we consolidate, we can still sort of, consolidate into close combat. So that's pretty nice. It's pretty big. We can talk about that a little bit more when we dive in and sort of take apart each one of these phases one by one. But I feel like, especially with the changes that they've done, now that Deep Strike doesn't exist, you can charge with things like Subterranean Assault or Teleport Strike or the Jump Pack Assault rule. All of those things we will get to, like I said, in a later date. But I do more or less like what they've done with the charge and fight phases. I think it's nice that we can sort of drag close by enemy units into the assault, and then we can then consolidate into another assault, more or less. So anyway, moving on to the last phase here, the morale phase. I do like it. It is nice that it's fairly simple. Matter of fact, I think it just has, it basically just has a like a sentence or two, and then like one extra paragraph for the morale phase. I think it's fairly self-explanatory. If the it says to make a morale test, roll a dice and add the number of models from the unit that have been slain this turn. If the result of the morale test exceeds the highest leadership characteristic in the unit, the test is failed. For each point the test is failed by, one model in that unit must flee and is removed from play. You choose which models flee from the units under your command. So that's pretty nice. It's pretty nice that they did sort of simplify morale, and so that now it really matters. There are a few changes to the units that have been made. For example, Death Company, that now have to take morale tests and are no longer fearless. We can touch upon that in a later video, but I'm not exactly too pleased with that. However, speaking of morale and wounds, there was one thing that I did forget to mention, which is how wounds are actually applied now. And so wounds are no longer applied to the closest model from the unit that did the damage. Now the defending player, so the player controlling the unit taking the damage, can then decide which models get removed, even if that model would be out of line of sight or out of range of the enemy weapons. So that's a big change. That means now you can have your heavy flamer, your plasma gun, or whatever the hell you want out in front of your tactical squad, and you can just be moving in, shooting, or whatever. And then if you take wounds, now you can just remove guys from the back. Alternatively, you could also remove guys from the front, let's say if you're locked in combat, and depending on how many of them you remove, you might actually no longer be locked in combat, because if you remove the first couple of guys in the front, then you would no longer be locked. Although I think, given the consolidation move, that might not stop your opponent, but who knows, maybe I'm just putting too much thought into that. But the changes to how wounds are applied. On one hand, it's nice because it allows you to. I can see, ways you can sort of take advantage of that. On the other hand, it is kind of a shame now that the positioning of your models don't matter so much anymore, and you can kind of be more or less. I wouldn't say careless, but now. With my tactical squad, for example, I can have like my heavy flamer and my melta-gun dudes be at the front and not have to worry about them, having to remove them or whatever. So, is it a little less tactically sound? Sure, but it is. It does add a nice element, and it does sort of give you the benefit of having your guys with the special weapons or the heavy weapons or any of the nice upgrade stuff. That you gave your unit, you can have them sort of stick around now, and you can just get rid of the other guys, which is good in some ways, bad in some ways, but it is a change that is certainly worth mentioning. Alright, so then they talk about fighting a battle, they talk about the battlefield, setting up terrain. They also have warlord traits. They only list 3 of them in the core rules. I am sure that when codexes come out, there will be, perhaps, I would hope a full list. List of 6, but we'll have to see on that one. But they do list 3 of them here. They're okay. Legendary fighter, you get to add 1 to your attacks characteristic when he charges. Inspiring leader, friendly units within 6 inches of the warlord, add 1 to their leadership. And then Tenacious Survivor, he basically gets a 6-up Feel No Pain, although it's not called Feel No Pain. And then they do have a fairly good basic mission called Only War. And I did spend a little bit of time reading through this, and this is, I think, a pretty good starting mission to do for someone, or, anyone who's really new to 40K. And I feel like if there was any mission you were going to play right out of the gate, right out of the box, I would pick Only War, simply because it's simple to understand, it's easy to set up, and it does have some varied objectives to go with, and it's really a nice template for missions, I feel like. So then they talk about a little bit more about open play again. Just sort of, take take whatever you want and throw it on the table. And then they talk about War Without End. They briefly mention team games, and then they have a couple of missions here. These I have not read. I have not spent as much time with open play as I have with narrative. Or match play, but they have Annihilation, Hold at All Costs, and Death or Glory. I'm sure that those are... Well, let me take a brief look at these. I'm sure they're good. So then we move on to narrative play, and like I said, I really do enjoy narrative play. I feel like it's a nice, easy way to build somewhat balanced lists in a reasonable amount of time. Purely because the way that the points are set up in the indexes are not the most optimized. Basically, they threw all the points values in the back of the book, under these really weird lists, and you now have to sort of hunt for everything. They're not nice and neat on the page like they were in the previous codices. So now we have to sort of do a little bit of math hammer, even more so now, because now they not only make us pay for the model, but they also make us pay for the weapons separately. So a tactical marine, I thought, was something like 13 points, and then they're equipped with bolt pistols and bolt guns, which I thought were like... I don't know if a bolt pistol is 0 or if it's 1. Anyway, they're making us pay for weapons and equipment separately now. So... and it specifically says that, when you look at the points section for units in your army, it specifically says, if they're not named characters, that the model points that are given do not include their war gear. So if you have a tactical squad with 10 guys in it, a sergeant with a power sword and a heavy bolter and a plasma gun, you first have to add up the points of the 7 dudes that don't have anything else with their bolt guns, bolt pistols, frag and crack grenades. Then you have to add up the points for the dude with the plasma gun. Then you have to add up the points for the dude with the heavy bolter, and then you have to add up the points for the sergeant with the power sword. It can be a little bit taxing, but it is nice that they did take match play seriously. and I can kind of appreciate the fact that now they've actually like pointed out like the individual war gear that each model has, and I feel like that. That's taking a step in the right direction to make things a little bit more balanced. But anyway, moving back on to narrative play, I do like it, and I feel as though it's pretty cool. You know, I looked at some of the rules, additional rules that narrative play missions had, like, you know, Dawn Raid, preliminary bombardment is pretty nasty. Sentry, sustained assault. Obviously, you know, these are not necessarily geared toward competitive things, but they're reasonably balanced that you can have some fun playing with them on the battlefield. Alright, so moving on here. Now we start getting into some of the missions. The first one that they talk about is Meat Grinder. They also have a few more of the stratagems listed here. Funny enough, most of the narrative missions are sort of based around the ideas of, you know, attackers and defenders, which is interesting. I'm not quite sure how I feel about that. It would have been nice if there was sort of like a few like neutral missions where you know, essentially both sides would have access to the same stratagems. But I feel like these missions are pretty cool. So they got Meat Grinder, Ambush, which is interesting, Patrol, let's see, Blitz, Sabotage, and I feel like the Rescue. Yeah, Rescue is sort of the last one. So pretty interesting stuff. They also briefly mention like historical battles, and they give an example here of the ambush at Dorak Pass, which is the Alpha Legion attacking like a Acadian regiment there. So then we move on to match play, and they go over how to choose armies. They talk about army faction, points limits. They also talk about organized events, and they actually give a pretty good guidelines as to points limits. So up to 1,000 points, you are limited to 2 detachments per army. Battlefield size should be 4x4, and the game length should take up to 2 hours. Then 1,001 points to 2,000 points, up to 3 detachments per army. 6x4, and that should take about 2 to 3 hours. And then for 2,001 points to 3,000, that's 4 detachments per army. That's 8x4 table size, and 3 or more hours. They briefly talk about reinforcements and the army roster and that sort of stuff. We can dive into that a little bit later. They do talk about choosing a mission. They have, of course, the Eternal War and the Maelstrom of War missions. They also talk about objective markers, which objective markers are now sort of measured to the center of the objective instead of within like its base or within 3 inches of a model. And that can cause some problems, but regardless, it's something that we'll either have to deal with or house rule, however we see fit. They also mention here. They mention for match play mission rules, there's 3 of them. There's Psychic Focus. It says, with the exception of Smite, each psychic power can be attempted only once per turn rather than once per Psyker turn. They also have Strategic Discipline. The same stratagem cannot be used by the same player more than once during any single phase. This does not affect stratagems that are not used during a phase, such as those used before the battle begins or at the end of the battle round. Then they also mention Tactical Reserves. Basically, you can't have more than half of your army in quote unquote deep strike. Deep strike doesn't exist anymore, but for Terminators you deploy them in the Teleportarium. For jump pack equipped Marines, you can deploy them high in the sky, as they say. Basically, you can't have more than half of your army off the table. Even if all of your army could be off the table, you can't do that in match play. So then they talk about the deployment maps, and there are 3 new ones. Spearhead Assault, which is kind of like an arrowheads at the far ends of the table. Dawn of War is the next one. We've seen that before. Then we have Search and Destroy, which is sort of the if you can imagine the table being divided up into 4 squares with a 9-inch circle in the middle. Players are basically deployed on the opposite ends. Basically, like, in opposite corners or whatever, with a 9-inch circle in the middle separating them. Hammer and Anvil, that we've seen before. Frontline Assault, which is both players are deployed along the long edge of the table in sort of an arrowhead formation. And then Vanguard Strike, which I forgot what it was called before. Maybe it wasn't called. Maybe it was called Vanguard Strike, but anyway, that's the really weird corner one where the armies are sort of deployed in like very weird triangle shapes along the corners of the table. So anyway, then we get into some of the Eternal War missions. Honestly, I haven't really read much of these. They're all just sort of there. Then they talk about tactical objectives. These are things that we've come to expect, and they also briefly mention the stratagem, new orders. And let me actually flip back here for a little bit, because I think I may have glossed over the stratagems. Maybe I didn't. Maybe they're on the next page. But yeah, so tactical objectives are back, woohoo. Then they get into some of the Maelstrom of War missions. Again, haven't spent too much time with these. But yeah. So then we hit the advanced rules. They cover battlefield terrain, Battleforged armies, battle zones, which are a new thing. They also mention expansions such as Planet Strike, Stronghold Assault, Cities of Death, and Death from the Skies. All of those sound interesting, with the exception of Death from the Skies, because I've never really been too interested in having like an all-flyer fight. Although I suppose it could be interesting. They also mention campaigns, and they go on and on. They briefly talk about battlefield roles. There's 9 of them. HQ, Troops, Elites, Fast Attack, Heavy Support, Dedicated Transport, Flyer, Fortification, Lord of War. We know these things. They also briefly mention factions and what they're doing with that. I'll probably make a separate video on that, because there are a few concerns that I have with regards to my personal army, but more or less it's something that we've all come to expect, and we did need the distinction of the various factions. But anyway, so here we have the 3 basic stratagems that we can use if we have a Battleforged army. So these can be used in match play and narrative play. So first one is command reroll. You get to roll any single dice for 1 command point. Cool. Counter defensive. The stratagem is used right after an enemy unit that charged has fought. Select one of your own eligible units and fight with it next. So that's 2 command points. Notice it says it's used right after an enemy unit that has charged has fought. So we can't stop them from fighting us, but we can sort of interrupt the sequencing of them fighting. So that is pretty nice. And then the last one is Insane Bravery. You can automatically pass a single morale test for 2 command points. Seeing as how much more stuff is much more lethal in this edition, Insane Bravery is going to be a pretty cool one. Alright, so moving on to the detachments. The first 3 basic ones are Patrol, Battalion, and Brigade. All of these are fairly sort of the I want to say that they're kind of like the standard go-to. So Patrol is going to be your standard for 1,000-point games. And then you have Battalion, which it might be like standard for like 2,000-point games. Brigade, I think, is going to be at least 3,000 plus. Although depending on what kind of army you play, you might be able to squeeze in a brigade in like a 2,000 or 2,500 point army, depending on how you equip them. Battalion certainly, but they briefly mention hey, you get plus 3 command points here. No command points for the patrol, plus 3 command points for the battalion, and plus 9 command points for the brigade detachment. They've also limited dedicated transports as well. I think for the most part, it's you may include one dedicated transport for each other choice, which is interesting. I'm just double checking now to see if that's different, and I don't think it is. So then we go on to some various other ones. We have the Vanguard detachment, which is sort of focused around elites, which only gives you +1 command point on top of the 3 that you start with. Then you have your Spearhead, which is sort of the heavy support detachment, again, only +1 command point. Then you have your Outrider detachment, which is focused on fast attack, again, +1 detachment, or +1 command point, excuse me. So then we move on to the Supreme Command, which is, 3 HQs, 0 to 1 elites, 0 to 1 Lord of War, +1 command point, so on and so forth. There's a Super Heavy, which is 3 to 5 Super Heavies. There's an Air Wing, which is 3 to 5 Flyers. A Super Heavy Auxiliary, which is just 1 Lord of War. A Fortification Network, which is 1 to 3 fortifications. Then you have a Auxiliary Support that actually costs you 1 command point. Which is basically like if you want to bring like anything else singularly, so 1 HQ or 1 troop, 1 elite, so on and so forth. Overall, I really do like what they've done with the new detachments. It's, I suppose it is kind of unfortunate that during this transition, a lot of the armies have lost their flavor, not only as far as special rules and things go, but also as far as like unique detachments and everything. However, I do feel that this was a change that was necessary, and once the codices come out, I have no doubt that the flavor of the armies will come back in the form of stratagems and that sort of thing. So, just sort of finishing up here, they do talk about battlefield terrain, specific rules for woods, ruins, craters, barricades, obstacles, Imperial Sanctuary or Imperial Statuary, fuel pipes, battlescapes, hills, that sort of stuff. They mention scratch-built terrain. I do like what they've done with the terrain. It is sort of nice that some of it is simplified, but they also have some stuff in here if you want to play with a little bit more fluff. Interestingly enough, they do specifically mention that in order for a unit to gain cover, if they're an infantry unit, they have to be wholly within or on the terrain in order to actually gain the +1 to their armor save. So gone are the days of hiding your units behind like a tree or something, and saying, oh well, they got they're 25% cover, therefore they get a cover save. That doesn't apply to infantry anymore. Infantry have to be wholly within or on a piece of terrain in order to gain cover from it, with the exception of the Imperial Statuary. I believe that is the only exception. As well as the barricades. With the barricades, you need to be within 1 inch in order for the models themselves to gain cover. So overall, I do like what they've done with the terrain stuff. So moving on, they do talk about battle zones, which I believe are a new addition. I've never heard of them previous to 8th edition. They show night fighting, they show fire and fury, and they also show psychic maelstrom. Again, these affect the entire battlefield, and they are nice. We will spend a little bit more time on those. Lastly, they go into the expansion. So Planet Strike, they have some specific stratagems and a mission regarding that. They also have Cities of Death. Again, more stratagems and a mission. Stronghold Assault, same deal, stratagems and a mission. And lastly, Death from the Skies, stratagems, mission. And I do want to say that it is really nice that they did include the extra expansions in the core rules, so that now, well, not the core rules, but in the main rulebook, I should say, which is really nice because it adds, it might be nice to, add some more flavor and or fluff to your game, and it's really nice to see them do that. And lastly, I keep on saying that, I'm like a broken record, they also talk about multiplayer battles, which is basically, more than two people, playing, 3 or more factions. I do like what they've done. They also give an example battle here of Carnage with the table deployments. Pretty good if you're playing 4-person. I would have liked to see a setup for a 3-player game, as I'm probably going to have one of those coming up with my buddies, but regardless, they also talk about campaigns, and they do have a nice little chart here of what the Warlord's choice to do is, and you play a different mission depending on what they say, so that is pretty neat. And then we get into the appendix, and wow, this video has been incredibly long, but I think I will sort of move on now to my overall impressions. Honestly, I've been fairly pleased with 8th edition. It hasn't been a perfect transition, but I think expecting perfection would be expecting too much. Overall, I'm pretty happy with most of the changes that we've seen, and I feel like the core rules, for the most part, are pretty tight. I feel like GW's put a lot of thought into them. They're not perfect. There are some flaws, and I can see some things changing in the future, but we can get into that in another video. So suffice it to say, your boy Son of Sanguinius is fairly happy with the core rules and the advanced rules in 8th edition, and I look forward to going over these with you guys in more detail in future videos. So anyway, I'm very curious to hear what your guys' thoughts are. Please feel to leave them down below in the comment section. And feel free to like and subscribe, and I will see you guys in the next video.